Not every great player announces himself loudly. Some of them simply appear, match after match, in the places that matter most, in the spaces between the pressure and the chaos, in the moments that require someone steady, someone who knows exactly what the game needs and provides it without ceremony. Ivan Rakitić was that kind of player. For almost 2 decades, he was present at the highest level of European football. He won a Champions League final. He lifted the Europa League as Sevilla's captain. He played in a World Cup final, wearing the red and white of Croatia. He was trusted by some of the most demanding coaches and technically gifted teammates in the modern history of the game. And yet, he was never the loudest voice, never the figure who pulled the attention of a room simply by entering it. There was something deliberately measured about him, something that felt considered rather than performed. He arrived in a league, earned trust, and stayed until it was time to move on. Then he did it again somewhere else. The career that began in the quiet of a Swiss town, moved through the discipline of German football, found warmth and belonging in Seville, reached its peak under the lights of Camp Nou, and finally came to rest somewhere closer to the Adriatic coast. A full life. A particular life. One worth settling in for. So let the day go. Let your breathing slow. And let the story begin. Rheinfelden is a small town that sits on the Rhine, on the border between Switzerland and Germany. It is not a place most football supporters would recognize by name. A quiet town, the river running alongside it, the landscape of the upper Rhine Valley spread out around it. The kind of place where the days have a regular rhythm and life does not ask too many dramatic questions. It was here, on March 10th, 1988, that Ivan Rakitić was born. His parents were Croatian. They had come to Switzerland as part of a generation of migrants from the former Yugoslavia, who settled in the German-speaking parts of Central Europe, drawn by work and stability, building lives in a country that was not the one they had grown up in. The Rakitic household was Croatian in its culture, its language, its emotional orientation. The family watched Croatian football. They felt connected to a place that was more than 1,000 kilometers away. And at the same time, Ivan was growing up Swiss. He was in Swiss schools, on Swiss streets, surrounded by Swiss friends and the particular textures of a Swiss childhood. This is a common kind of experience for children of migrants, and it creates a particular inner life. You belong to two places at once, and to neither completely. You move between languages and references and ways of seeing the world. You are always, to some small degree, translating. For Ivan Rakitić, this experience of being between things would eventually become one of the defining qualities of how he moved through life. The capacity to adapt, the ability to enter a new environment and find his place within it without needing to change who he was at the core. But before any of that, he was simply a boy, growing up near the Rhine and falling in love with football. Football arrived the way it usually does for children in European towns, organically and early, through games in parks and on local pitches, through older players and younger ones, through the simple pleasure of a ball and space and time. Rakitic was drawn to it with genuine intensity. His brother, Dejan, was also a footballer, and the two of them grew up in an environment where the sport was a serious family interest, as well as a source of joy. The Croatian football culture of their parents' background existed alongside the local Swiss football scene, and Ivan absorbed both. He was technically gifted from a young age. The kind of player whose touch was clean and natural, whose reading of space seemed more developed than you would expect. But what people who watched him early seemed to note most was not just the ability, it was the attitude, a quality of focus that was consistent and not dramatic. He joined FC Basel's youth academy. FC Basel was, and remains, the most successful club in Swiss football. Based in the city of Basel, close to the borders with Germany and France, the club had a tradition of developing young players and competing in European football. Their academy was well organized and serious, the kind of environment that rewarded players who were capable of absorbing coaching and applying it with discipline. Rakitic flourished there. The years of youth football at Basel were the years in which the technical foundation of his game was properly built. The passing range, the control under pressure, the understanding of positioning that would later make him one of the most reliable midfielders in European football. He was not a flashy player. He never particularly was. But he was clean, clear thinking, someone whose decisions on the ball were almost always correct, whose understanding of where to be and when made him easy to play alongside. Basel's senior team began to take notice. His debut for the Basel first team came when he was still a teenager. The Swiss Super League was the environment where he first tested himself against adult professional opponents, and the transition, while always demanding for any young player, went smoothly enough to suggest that the step-up was not beyond him. He played with composure. The things that had set him apart in the academy, the technical quality, the reading of the game, the ability to receive the ball under pressure and use it well, transferred without major disruption into the professional environment. Basel, in those years, were Swiss champions. They competed in European football. The young Rakitic was not just making up numbers. He was contributing. What was being shaped at Basel during those first senior years was not simply a good domestic player. It was the beginning of a career that had a different kind of ceiling. For Rakitic, the attention from larger markets eventually came from Germany. Schalke 04 are one of the significant institutions of German football. Their home is Gelsenkirchen, a city in the Ruhr area of Western Germany, an industrial region with a deep working-class identity and a football culture that reflects that character. Schalke's supporters are passionate in the way that clubs with that kind of community bond tend to produce. The connection between the club and the city is not complicated or conditional. It is simply there. Rakitic joined Schalke in 2007. He was 19 years old. The Bundesliga was, in many ways, the ideal next step for a player with his profile. German football in that era was intensely competitive, physically demanding, and tactically sophisticated. The midfield positions in particular were fiercely contested, and the expectation on a player receiving and distributing the ball under pressure was high. Adapting to that required more than technical ability. It required fitness, mental resilience, and the capacity to absorb information quickly and apply it in real time. Rakitic adapted. His first season was the kind of learning experience that all young players go through when they step up. More demands, faster opponents, smaller margins for error. By his second and third seasons, the adjustment was complete. He was playing regularly. He was contributing. The qualities that had made him stand out at Basel were now being expressed in one of Europe's major domestic leagues, and they were holding up. The technical quality, the composure in possession, the capacity to connect the defensive and attacking phases of the game, all of it was present. His years at Schalke were not years of great trophies or enormous individual recognition. They were years of work, of development, of a player becoming more complete and more trusted. The experience of living in the Ruhr, in Gelsenkirchen's particular working-class atmosphere, was another layer of the life he was building. A third country now, after Switzerland and the Croatia of his family's identity. A third set of streets and rhythms and daily textures. He was becoming someone whose range of experience was quietly expanding, in ways that would eventually show itself in how he played. In 2011, Rakitic moved to Sevilla. Sevilla Football Club is one of the oldest and most historically significant clubs in Spain. Their home is in Andalusia, in the south, in a city that sits beside the Guadalquivir River, warm and ornate, and unlike anywhere else in Europe. The move to Spain represented another shift. A new language, a different climate, a football culture that placed enormous value on technical quality and the intelligent use of possession. La Liga in that era was among the most technically demanding leagues in the world, shaped by the philosophy of the best Barcelona and Spain teams that had been dominant across European football. Rakitic arrived in Seville, and in time, it became the place in his career that felt most like home. He learned Spanish. He settled into the city. His family were with him. And on the pitch, his game found a context that suited it almost perfectly. La Liga demanded exactly what he was best at: the ability to receive the ball in tight situations and use it cleanly, the positioning to find space between the lines, the discipline to cover ground defensively, and then arrive in useful positions when the team had the ball. At Sevilla, he was not one player among many equally valued contributors. He became, over the years of his time there, the central figure of the midfield, the player around whom the team's tempo was organized. He was made captain. That says something important about how Rakitic was perceived by the people around him. Captaincy at a major club is not purely about talent. It is about trust, about reliability under pressure, and a quality of leadership that does not depend on volume or performance. He was trusted. The 2013-14 season brought Sevilla to the Europa League final. The final was played in Turin against Benfica of Portugal. Rakitic captained Sevilla that night. Sevilla won the Europa League. He had captained his club to European glory, and in doing so, confirmed something beyond talent: the capacity to carry weight and deliver when the pressure was highest. He had delivered. Shortly after that Europa League triumph, the conversation about Ivan Rakitić shifted. Barcelona were watching him, had been watching him for some time, in fact, because Barcelona in that era had very specific needs in midfield, very specific ideas about the kind of player who could function within their system. And they had identified Rakitic as someone who could not only fit but contribute meaningfully. Moving to Barcelona in 2014 was not a move that many midfielders of his profile made. Barcelona's midfield was among the most technically refined in the history of the game. Xavi Hernandez, Andrés Iniesta, Sergio Busquets. These were players of extraordinary quality, footballers whose names belonged in any serious discussion of the finest midfielders of the modern era. Joining that group was not a simple matter of arriving and slotting in. It required a very particular kind of quality. You could not be average in your decision-making. You could not be slow in your thinking. You had to arrive already fluent in the language of that style of play. Rakitic was fluent. His first season at Barcelona was one of the most successful in the club's modern history. The team won La Liga. They won the Copa del Rey, and they reached the UEFA Champions League final, which was played in Berlin against Juventus. The Champions League final at the Olympic Stadium in Berlin on June 6, 2015, was one of the most watched sporting events of that year: Barcelona against Juventus. two of the great clubs of European football meeting for the right to be called the continent's best. The match began, and within 4 minutes, Barcelona scored. The goal was Rakitic. He received the ball in the penalty area and finished it calmly, without drama, into the corner of the net. The kind of finish that looks simple and is only simple because the player is so technically certain that he makes it look that way. Barcelona led early. They would go on to win the match. And Ivan Rakitić, the boy from Rheinfelden, who had moved between Switzerland and Germany and then to Spain, had scored the opening goal in a Champions League final. It was not a spectacular, acrobatic effort. It was not a long-range thunderbolt. It was a clean, composed finish from someone who knew exactly what he needed to do and did it. The treble was complete. La Liga, Copa del Rey, Champions League. And Rakitic had been central to all of it. The years that followed at Barcelona settled into a rhythm that suited both the player and the club. He was not always the most discussed member of the squad. In a team containing Lionel Messi, and later Luis Suarez and Neymar, and with midfielders of the stature of Iniesta still present, the spotlight moved naturally toward the most dramatic performances. Rakitic operated slightly to one side of that spotlight. He was there, every week, doing the things that made the team work. The short passes that kept possession moving. The longer ones that shifted the angle of attack. The defensive positioning that protected Busquets and the backline. The consistent availability to receive and use the ball even in difficult moments of a match. He was described by coaches and teammates as someone who was always prepared, always professional, someone who could play 100 matches in a season and maintain his standards, not through inspiration alone, but through discipline and organization. That quality is less glamorous to describe than brilliance, but it is rarer than it seems, and it is essential. A team built around exceptional creative talent needs people who are reliable, whose contribution is not conditional on feeling good or on playing with a particular freedom, whose standards hold regardless of the occasion. Rakitic was that person. While his club career was building toward its peak, Ivan Rakitić had made a choice about which country he would represent internationally. He had been born in Switzerland and raised there. He could have represented Switzerland. There had been conversations at earlier points about his international future, but he chose Croatia. The choice was rooted in identity. In the household he had grown up in, the language spoken, the culture his parents had brought with them from the Dalmatian coast. Croatia was not simply a place he had spent time. It was the deeper current of who he was, the part of his identity that ran below the Swiss surface of his daily life. The Croatian national team of his generation was, in football terms, genuinely impressive. Croatia has always produced technically gifted midfielders in particular, and the generation that came through in the 2000s had a quality that was widely acknowledged. Luka Modric was already one of the finest midfielders in the world. Rakitic fitted naturally alongside him, the two of them complementing each other in a way that gave Croatia a midfield that could compete with any country in the world. The shirts were red and white checked. The tournaments were long and emotionally intense. And for a country of Croatia's size, reaching deep into major competitions carried a weight that supporters felt in a way that is hard to fully convey from the outside. The 2018 World Cup in Russia was the tournament that most clearly illustrated what Croatia's generation of players was capable of. They moved through the tournament with a combination of technical quality and psychological resilience that surprised much of the football world, though perhaps it should not have. They beat Argentina in the group stage. They won 3 consecutive knockout matches that went to extra time or penalties. They beat England in the semi-final, and they reached the final. The World Cup final against France in Moscow on July the 15th, 2018, was a culmination of something enormous for Croatian football, a country of 4 million people competing at the very last stage of the world's biggest sporting event. They lost the final. France were strong and clinical and won 4-2. But the journey itself had been remarkable. The matches, the pressure, the cumulative effort of playing 3 extra time or penalty knockout games and still arriving at the final with enough to compete. Rakitic was present throughout, in midfield, alongside Modric, doing what he always did, receiving the ball, distributing it, covering, positioning, competing. He was not the most flamboyant player in that Croatian side. Modric, who won the Ballon d'Or that year, was the creative heart of the team. But Rakitic was the balance, the player who allowed Modric and others the freedom to express themselves, because someone was managing the structural work alongside him. That silver medal, if that is the right way to frame a World Cup runner-up finish, represented something real and large in Croatian football history, and Rakitic had been part of it from the first match to the last. By the late years of his time at Barcelona, the landscape had changed. Some of the great players of that era were moving on. Iniesta left in 2018. Xavi had gone earlier. The team was transitioning, as all teams eventually do, and Rakitic's own situation at the club was no longer as settled as it had been in the middle years. He was still playing. He was still, when selected, performing at a level that was demonstrably high. But the dynamics of large clubs shift over time, and a player in his early 30s occupies a different kind of position than one in his mid-20s. In the summer of 2020, Ivan Rakitić returned to Sevilla. The return had a particular feeling to it. This was not the same kind of arrival as the first time, when he had come as a talented player with things to prove. Now he was coming back as someone who had won a Champions League, who had been to a World Cup final, who had experienced the very highest levels of the game and carried that experience with him. Sevilla received him warmly. The city, the club, the supporters, the familiarity of the streets and the light. He was not a stranger returning. He was, in some sense, coming home. The second chapter at Sevilla was different in texture from the first. He was no longer the same player he had been. No player in their 30s is the same as in their mid-20s. The pace is a little slower. Recovery takes longer. The physical intensity of a long career accumulates in ways that are managed rather than ignored. But the qualities that had made him valuable were not speed-dependent. They were intelligence-dependent. And intelligence in football does not decline the way pace does. He read the game. He used the ball efficiently. He understood positioning at a level that came from thousands of hours of professional experience. Younger players around him were learning simply by watching what he did and where he went. His second time at Sevilla stretched across several seasons. He played a part in the team's campaigns, not always as a regular starter in the way he had once been, but as a significant presence. A player whose contribution was valued even when it was not always the most visible. He continued representing Croatia. The later international tournaments were more difficult. Croatia's golden generation was aging together, as generations do, and the performances were sometimes inconsistent. But the connection to the national team, to the red and white, to the meaning that wearing that shirt had always carried for him, remained. There is something worth slowing down for in the image of Rakitic at a training ground in Seville. Late in his career, he would have been one of the oldest players there. The young professionals around him in their early 20s looking at him the way young players look at veterans who have done the things they are hoping to do. And he would have been there early, prepared, doing the work with the same approach he had always brought. That consistency of character is not a small thing. It is one of the things that separates footballers who are merely talented from those who build careers of real length and real quality. In the final stage of his playing life, Rakitic made a decision that carried a particular meaning. He joined Hajduk Split. Hajduk Split are one of the oldest and most beloved clubs in Croatian football. Their home is Split, on the Dalmatian coast, a city of white stone and salt air, and the blue of the Adriatic stretching out to the horizon. Hajduk's history stretches back more than a century. They are a club with deep roots in the identity of the region, beloved by supporters for whom the connection to the club goes well beyond result. For Rakitic, joining Hajduk was a way of closing a circle. He had chosen Croatia as his country. He had represented it in major tournaments, worn the shirt through qualifying campaigns and summer tournaments, and the greatest night of Croatian football history. And now, in the final chapter of his playing career, he was bringing himself to the Dalmatian coast, to the club that represented the heart of the part of Croatia his family came from. It was not a business decision. It was not a move designed to maximize playing time or salary. It was something more fundamental than that, a choice to end the football life in a place that meant something deep. The matches at Hajduk Split were different in atmosphere from what he had known at Barcelona or Sevilla. The stadium in Split, the Stadion Polhud, sits close to the sea, and the supporters are vocal and loyal in the way of clubs with deep community roots. He was welcomed as someone who belonged. His time at Hajduk was not about performance at the highest level. It was about presence. He played, he contributed, he was part of the daily rhythms of a football club. But the significance was in the fact of being there at all. Rakitic handled that final transition with the same quality of character that had run through everything else. His retirement, confirmed in 2025, was not announced with fanfare or lengthy ceremonies. Though there were acknowledgements from clubs and teammates and governing bodies who understood the significance of what was ending. The career had been, by any measure, remarkable. A boy born in Rheinfelden, raised between Swiss streets and Croatian culture, who had taken his football through the academies of Basel, across to the Ruhr and the Bundesliga, with Schalke, south to Seville, and the warm intensity of La Liga, up to the very summit of the game at Camp Nou, and then back through Seville once more, before finally arriving on the Dalmatian coast. The trophies were real and significant. La Liga titles, Copa del Rey, the Europa League as Sevilla captain, the Champions League treble with Barcelona, a World Cup finalists medal with Croatia, the goal in Berlin, the long nights in midfield for a red and white Croatian shirt, the decades of professional discipline and technical clarity, and the quiet accumulation of trust from everyone he had worked with. What remains when a career like this is finished and the noise of sport has moved on to other stories is something less quantifiable. It is the sense of what a person brought to their work, not just how good they were, but how they went about it, what they valued, what they gave to the people around them. Rakitic was described throughout his career by coaches and teammates in terms that are not always the first vocabulary of football coverage. His reliability, his intelligence, his consistency, the way he made training sessions better and match days calmer, the capacity to perform in finals without visibly changing from how he performed on any other day. Those qualities are harder to see than spectacular goals or moments of individual brilliance, but they are, in the long view, among the most valuable things a professional footballer can bring. He brought them everywhere he went, but the meaning of what that generation accomplished together is not diminished by time. Croatia reaching a World Cup final resonated far beyond the country's borders. It said something about what a small nation can produce when the conditions are right, and about the players who chose to represent that flag with full commitment across long careers. He was part of that. The city of Split in the late afternoon has a particular quality of light. The stone of the old city glows in a warm way. The Adriatic sits still and blue. The sound of the city carries in the heat, and then the light softens and the day begins to ease. For a man who had spent years in the grey of Swiss winters and the cold of German autumns and the fierce heat of Andalusian summers and the endless professional demands of life at a club the size of Barcelona, there is something deeply right about a final chapter in that light, in a city by the sea, in a place that had meaning before football gave it new meaning, in a stadium where the crowd knows every name on the pitch and the connection between the people and the club is simple and long and real. The game of football, at its highest level, tends to celebrate particular kinds of players. It celebrates the ones who score the most, the ones who make the most dramatic interventions, the ones who can carry a match on their own, whose individual quality is so overwhelming that the result of a game bends around them. Rakitic was never quite that player. He was never the one who a team was built around in that singular way. He was, instead, the one who allowed others to be that player. The one whose presence and quality created the conditions in which brilliance could exist. That is a harder thing to explain, but it is not a lesser thing. It takes a very specific kind of intelligence to understand what a team needs, rather than what you individually want to provide, to know when to play the simple ball rather than the ambitious one, to understand that your value on a given day might be measured entirely in passes you didn't lose and positions you took that you will receive no credit for. Rakitic understood that. He chose it, and in doing so, he helped some of the finest football teams of the modern era function at their best. There is a version of football memory that focuses on names that carry a certain weight of legend. It is natural to remember the extraordinary in those terms, the players who changed what people believed was possible, the goals that genuinely could not have been scored, the performances that left even experienced observers with nothing adequate to say. Rakitic belongs to a different and equally real category of football memory, the player you trusted, the one who was there when you needed the game managed, when the team needed the ball kept, when the match needed someone to hold things together, the one who appeared in the right place, again and again, without needing to announce that they had arrived. Barcelona supporters who watched the treble-winning season and the Champions League final in Berlin remember him. Sevilla supporters remember him in both chapters. Croatian supporters remember the long journey through 2018, the matches that went to extra time, the final in Moscow, the dignity of a team that had given everything and came within one result of the very top of the world. And those who watched him closely remember a player who seemed in some fundamental way to understand the game better than almost anyone around him. The evening settles over Split. The sea darkens. The old stones hold the last of the warmth. The city breathes out after the day. And the story of a career, long and cross-continental and real, finds its natural ending here. A boy who grew up near the Rhine, who learned football in Swiss youth teams and at FC Basel, who earned his place in German football, and then Spanish football, and then at the very summit of the game, in one of the greatest clubs in the history of the sport, who scored in a Champions League final, who led Sevilla to European glory, who stood in midfield for Croatia and helped carry that small country to a World Cup final, who came back to the Adriatic at the end, to a city of white stone and blue water, and played football because he still loved football, not because of what it offered him, but because of what it was, who retired in 2025 with a quiet kind of completeness, not a story of tragedy or lost potential or dramatic collapse, a story of a career that followed its own particular shape from beginning to end, that earned trust in every place it visited, that contributed to great football without needing to dominate every conversation about it. There is something restful in that kind of ending. Not every great career ends in noise. Some end naturally, through the ordinary passage of seasons and years, through the slow recognition that the time has come to step back. He stepped back. The game went on without him, as it always does. And he remained, in his life, with his family, with the experience of everything that had happened. A Croatian heart raised on Swiss streets, a footballer who had worked consistently and intelligently at the highest level of his sport for nearly 2 decades, at the end, by the Adriatic, in the light of the city that had meant something even before all the rest of it began. Let the image settle now. The sea at dusk, the light gone low and warm, the sounds of the city moving slowly into evening. Somewhere in that world, the career of Ivan Rakitić has found its final resting point. All the years of training, all the flights between countries, all the matches in winter stadiums and summer arenas, and neutral venues in European cities, all the decisions made in fractions of seconds with the ball at his feet and thousands of people watching, all the trophies lifted and tournaments played and international matches carried through long, hot summers. It is done, and it was, by the measure of what a football life can be, enough. More than enough. Let your breathing go slow now. Let the noise of the day move further away. The story has reached its natural end, and it is a good one. A quiet architect, a steady hand, a career built in the spaces between the noise, where the most important work so often happens. He was there. He was trusted. He left things better than he found them. And that, for any life, is a fine thing to have done.